So the last part of the video, so this is a little bit more of a bit of my pet section, I should say, more than anything else. So there's no real content, but in the Blackboard Collaborate sessions, there were a couple of questions which I asked. So the first relates to demand aggregation. So if you sort of recall, right, we have a bunch of demand curves, right? And this might be for firm 1 and for firm 2, okay? And assuming that this market consists of just 2 firms, hopefully you should then remember that the way to obtain the market demand, so firm 2, is to basically just sum up these two. So at a particular price point, okay, let's say that that's $1 and this is $1, okay. This might be then, let's say 3 units, and let's say this is 2 units. So at a price of $1, you'd say that, well, this is really 5, okay. So this is what we call horizontal summing, okay. And as you lift the prices, okay, so at price of $2, okay, you would then have, let's say, 1.5, and at $2, okay, you then have, let's say, 2.5, okay. And if you add these two numbers up at price $2, you would then have 4 units, okay. And then you basically do that for every unit and you get a market demand. So this is market. Okay, so hopefully you guys understand this, okay. So hopefully you guys have gone through the textbook, and one of the key things that we wrote in there is that actually in a perfectly competitive market, okay, what you get is actually a horizontal line in terms of the demand faced by the firm. So demand faced by firm 1. It's simply just a horizontal line. So the question which I asked a couple of people on Tuesday in the previous Collaborate session was basically simply this. If firm 1's actual line is horizontal, and the same thing applies for firm 2, okay, because we're in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so firm 2 demand, okay, and it's the same price, okay. How is it actually possible that we actually get this as the market demand? Because if I were to add 2 horizontal lines, I should simply just get a horizontal line. That was the paradox. And I think I got a few people very, very, shall we say, a little bit worked up, shall we say. They were kind of very, very like scratching their heads and said, well, mathematically, how do you get from horizontal lines to something that's downward sloping? Okay, and a hint I kind of dropped to them is, remember what this is. It lies in the details, guys. This is demand faced by the firm. This is market demand. Think carefully about the demand faced by the firm. Okay. With the demand faced by the firm, how do we actually get this? And you would then say to me, well, it's just simply the fact that they are a price taker. They just take prices as given, right? Because if you want to go up, right, you're going to be priced above everyone and no one is going to buy from you. And if you price below that, in equilibrium, you're going to be below your average total cost. So then hence you just simply shut down, and hence you wouldn't supply any units. This is why you have a horizontal line. And I'd say you're exactly right. But the key thing to remember is that you've also simplified a lot of the analysis, and this is actually a result, right? It's the result of us being a price taker. If we really want to sketch this whole thing out, supposing that we're not in a market to do with equilibrium, okay? So let's think about firm 1. Okay, suppose that this is the price and it's not equilibrium. So then what would actually happen, right? Obviously, for firm 1, if I am priced above everyone else, what would then be my demand? Well, I'd get no demand, isn't it? At this particular, if I were to drop my price down to whatever the price the market is setting, then this is going to be my demand, isn't it? It will be, for example, if there are 100 firms and 100 and the quantity supplied is 100, then each of those firms will supply 1 unit, right? That's basically the idea. But what if we were to then say, okay, what if I were to go below that? Well, in theory, it will look something like this. It's downward sloping, isn't it? Right? I would actually undercut everyone and actually get the entire market demand, wouldn't I? Right? That's effectively, if we want to be very precise about this, this is basically the firm's demand. So this is basically what would happen if we're not at the equilibrium price. And if you think about this, if I were to add all of this for every single firm involved and at every single price level, okay, I would indeed actually get this market demand up here. But note that this is demand faced by the firm. So what am I also considering? I also need to consider the behavior of other firms. And this is something which we'll definitely touch on in chapter 8. But this explains why this is not the same as aggregating this, or this is not the same as getting this, because this has additional constraints. The additional constraints are that it also considers the behavior of other firms, right? So this, which is the market demand, just tells you exactly why it is the market demand. This is the firm faced by the individual firm. And when you're talking about the demand faced by the individual firm, you also have to consider the behavior of all the other participants in this market. Hence the reason why this summing up is not going to necessarily give you this, or this summing up is not necessarily going to give you this, because these things have additional assumptions and additional constraints. In this case here, where we've assumed that everyone is in equilibrium, number one. Number two, we've basically assumed that effectively everyone is going to be at the minimum of the ATC curve. So hence there's no incentive for them to drop below that, right? And for a perfectly competitive market, that is the outcome. So again, this is summarizing, these curves are summarizing a particular result that we've basically imposed. It's a result, right? So here, the idea of a price taker, the idea of being in equilibrium, the idea that everyone is at the minimum of the ATC curve is all being captured here, right? They're measuring two completely different things. So that's the first thing I want you guys to be very aware of, okay? The second thing is, I think some of you are getting a little bit confused with the supply curve, okay? So for some of you, this is a very familiar diagram, but some of you are also getting confused between the long run and the short run, okay? So the key thing here that we want you to understand is that in the long run, right, the supply curve can be horizontal. And you guys say, well, why would that necessarily be the case? And intuitively, there are a couple of things that we've assumed here to get this particular result. The first is that we have identical firms. In other words, they are identical in cost. They have identical structures, everything exactly the same. So what would happen if they are identical? That would also suggest that they have exactly the same cost curves, right? And think about what would happen in the long run. If the price is above equilibrium, then what would you as a firm do? You basically cut your price until the point that you're making no profits. So for example, if the price is $5 and your marginal cost is then $3, you then slice it down to $4 and say, okay, I'm going to try and grab as much profit as I can. And this will continue up until the point where you are at the minimum of your ATC. But remember, for this particular firm, it is the same for every single other firm. Hence, it is horizontal, because each of these quantities are maybe supplied by different firms, but the price will be exactly here, and the decision to supply will be dictated by that one single horizontal line. They all face the same cost. So you're going to say then, if that's the case, then what you're saying, Jonathan, is that it's actually possible for it to be upward sloping and downward sloping. And I'd say, yes, absolutely. You'd be absolutely right. If this thing is upward sloping, it's what we call an increasing cost industry. So as a note, this is really slightly beyond the scope of the course, but it is mentioned in the textbook. So in other words, the more you produce, right, for those additional units, you actually have to pay more for them. So in other words, the minimum of the ATC is actually increasing. The supply curve, long run supply curve, is possible for it to also be downward sloping. In other words, it is possible for this curve to be downward sloping because the minimum of the average total cost curve is actually decreasing the more you supply. Okay, so just be aware that, again, this horizontal line has a very specific assumption, and that very specific assumption is that we have identical firms, or at the very least, identical cost structures, right? So that is something which I also wanted to emphasize, because it seems that some of you are getting confused between this diagram and this thing here. In this particular case, we're in the short run scenario. In this case here, we're talking about the long run, and hopefully you guys understand what the difference between the long run and the short run is. Remember, short run means that there is at least one factor of production that is variable. In the long run, it is all factors of production are variable. So the short run, let me rephrase that, is where at least there is one factor of production that is fixed. In the long run, everything is variable. So just be aware of that. It's very, very important. And these were the couple of things which I really wanted to emphasize. And hopefully, this should wrap up most of our material as to what was basically posed during the break. And in the next lecture, let's see what you guys propose. But I got a feeling that I'm going to get quite a few questions about international trade. So it'll be good for you guys to kind of revise that. And as always, a bit of a gentle reminder, remember that your assessments are due next week. So all the very best, and I'll see you all online very soon.